Hello, welcome to Picture Me Coding with Eric Aker and Mike Mall. Today, to talk about what we're doing on the show, I'd like to pass the microphone over to my co-host, Mike Mall. Mike, how you doing?
Doing all right, Eric. Thank you. So we have another guest today. Our guest is a former colleague of mine named Chris Staszak, who hired me back in the aughts to work on music recommendations. And he's been a CTO for a number of years and is currently the CTO of an organization called Logic Boost Labs. And he's going to talk to us today a bit about evaluating startups and steps you have to go through as a startup founder. Would you like to say anything about your background, Chris?
Yeah, certainly. Thank you for having me on the show. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to reconnect with you, Mike, under these circumstances. Yeah, my background is I started off as a precocious young kid at the age of, early teens. And for some reason, my parents decided to put an Apple IIe in front of me. And my life has been a train wreck ever since. So software engineer by trade and training. I've been doing that in the startup world for 3 decades now. And seen a lot, done a lot, learned a lot along the way. And now I've been the good fortune where I actually run the day-to-day operations of a small boutique VC accelerator here based in San Diego called Logic Boost Labs. And now I'm able to apply all those learnings and whatnot to our actual looking for investments and helping those startup companies succeed.
So when you're helping out other startups, you probably have to advise them on what their shape of their org should look like, and you're kind of helping out other CTOs potentially. It sounds like, is that right?
Well, in some cases, yes. I mean, it really runs the gamut. So pretty much anything you can imagine in terms of maturity, structure, lack thereof, startups, early stage, which is where we focus. I mean, literally 2 founders in a garage is our sweet spot. To that end, it really runs the gamut. So we find people that are technical founders that maybe they don't understand, they couldn't sell to save their life, but they have a wonderful product that needs help there. We have folks that are non-technical founders who they bemoan the fact that they outsourced, offshored the development of their great idea, and this is the 3rd time they're having to redo it, and everything in between. So, that's kind of a bookends on the landscape, if you will.
So Chris and I also share a history of doing sort of lengthy and gruesome endurance events. Chris was you were like a pro bike racer at one point, right, Chris?
I never achieved those rings. That was the aspiration. I made it to a reasonably proficient amateur level. So I did that for a decade in my youth, cycling. So, while I was in that world, of course, everyone's dream was to be a professional, do the world tour, race the Tour de France, or whatever the case may be there. I certainly did not have the innate capability or genetics or anything in between, or even in that era, knew the right doctors to help me assist with that, right? So I did that for a number of years, and really it was the sport of my youth. And today it's kind of it's a cheaper outlet than the therapy when it comes to getting outside and just enjoying the great outdoors. And of course, here in San Diego, we can't have it any better, right? We're very lucky that way.
Mm-hmm. So as you know, Chris, we tend to talk about music on this podcast. I was thinking back on those days in the aughts when we were working at Music Match and then at Yahoo doing music recommender systems. And there was this period of sort of weird indie folk music that was sort of came out of nowhere and then kind of hasn't entirely faded away, but is certainly not as popular. But during that period, there was Wilco, there was Bon Iver, the Fleet Foxes,
Iron and Wine.
Nico Case did Fox Confessor Brings the Flood. There was Bright Eyes, Sunkill Moon, a band called Caliphone, who actually came out with a really good album this year. So anyway, I just kind of wanted to give a nod to the mid-aughts weird indie folk.
I remember starting to hear banjos in songs in indie rock, and I was like, "What's this? A banjo? I
Yeah,
think I like it."
yeah, that was 2005, I think, was Sufjan Stevens' Illinois, which was, great album and also lots of banjo.
Well, that was one of our, I think, Mike, you may recall, one of our regrets was trying to surface the long tail, which had a lot of, there's interesting parts within an ocean of not very good music. And how do we surface the good, interesting parts? Because, we obviously had systems that amplified what was popular, became more popular, right? So kind of, flywheel effect there. And I think that was one of the things that, we had deep interest in is, how do we reach into a catalog with millions of songs that virtually no one listens to?
And at the time, everyone listened to Britney Spears, whether they admitted it or not. So
Correct, right? Yeah, absolutely.
So, Chris, you've been in a startup landscape for a long time, and I am curious. You said 3 decades. It's probably changed quite a lot in the last 3 decades. Yeah. Any notable changes that leap to mind when you think about what it's like now versus in decades previous?
Yeah, I was lucky enough to kind of really get my feet wet right at the cusp of the internet becoming an allowable commercial thing, right? So at that point in time, everyone shrugged. What is this thing? There were a few people that had the vision that this is going to go to the moon and, be humanity's next big thing. Looking back, we can see that it's become that. And, at that time, once people got a little bit of a whiff of it, then it became, hey, we're going to throw money, make bets on companies because this could be the new gold rush, right? And so there was a lot of silliness there where people would just jump in and get on board with companies that had no business being companies per se, right? So to that end, there was just this weird phase of everyone was scrambling for the hills, trying to stake their claim, and no one really knew what was going on, right? And then over time, like all these cycles, as they ebb and flow, folks got a little more rational and serious and started to think about like, okay, where's the true business case for these companies? How are we going to make money? Everything can't be free. And then, of course, we have an internet today where, I can't click on a web page without it knowing what I had for breakfast to push some advertising at me and all the rest of the ilk that comes with that. And then, as I fast forward, thinking back in time, we went to the place where everything went nuts in terms of, are we going to overnight deliver bags of concrete for free shipping? That type of crazy example. This business will make it up in volume, right? So crazy business models like that. And then you have the case where folks, they would state a valuation that was, quote, pre-revenue, right? So they're trying to be more sophisticated with their investors. But the truth is they didn't have a viable business at the time and everything was just based on a hope and dream. And some of these things actually became viable, right? But by far and large, a lot of them failed by the wayside. And then when I look, in more recent time, I see where there's specific technology sets that have become this hype cycle type of approach. So we had crypto hype cycle, right? And everything around that, from it's the future of money to it's our libertarian utopia and everything in between. I'm not quite sure how that's shaken out. I'll use FTX as exhibit A of one quadrant of that, right? We have, quite obviously now, we have the AI, whatever that term really means, revolution upon us. That's pretty interesting, for folks that actually understand how that works under the hood. That's very interesting. For the vast majority of people who don't understand it, it's an opportunity to glom onto a new hype cycle. But I'm seeing that kind of diminish a little bit as people are getting, again, a little more sober, and people are understanding a bit more about what it can do and the limitations and what have you. So it's been it's been an interesting ride to see this arc, and the pattern just repeats, just like anything, right? Stock markets have booms and busts over this period of time. It's been no exception.
Well, it's great that you drew out that pattern, because as you were speaking about early days of the internet, my mind immediately was like, oh, that sounds like these people talking about cryptocurrency companies, or, oh, that sounds like people pitching AI-based companies. Do you think that seeing those hype cycles gives you an advantage to sniff out the, people who are building their company pitch on maybe a fantasy? Are you better? You get better at it, or is it still hard to see through the hype to what's real, what's going to last?
Not to be negative about it, but what it does is it kind of enhances my BS detector, right? So I'll start to ask questions very quickly to, is this hype or is this real? Do you understand what you're talking about? And sometimes the answer is sadly no. It's just acronym soup being thrown at me, right? In some cases, it's actually foundationally amazing, whatever the case may be. And so, yeah, it's definitely honed my sense of sniff out the good things in an ocean of what's real here or not. And I think, if we talk about due diligence a little bit later, that's really one of the highlights of the due diligence process is, as an investor, what's real, and getting to the bedrock of that question.
A few years ago, the tech job market was generally pretty frothy, and seemed like there was a lot of VC being thrown at a lot of different ideas. But the last couple of years, we've seen layoffs from the FANG companies, and we've seen inflation and money harder to get. Has that changed the way that you look at startups now?
For my day job, our stance hasn't changed. Like, we are aggressively seeking out investments, and if we have a good one that comes across our path, we will pounce on it immediately with no hesitation, based upon kind of the formulaic approach that we'll have as far as how much we'll invest and the type of profile of the company, et cetera, et cetera. And so it'll depend on the investor or the fund, right? Some folks have decided to keep their powder dry, or whatever term they want to use, because there's a lot of uncertainty as to where things are going economically. Other folks are seeing that, as quite a few will do, say that's the best opportunity to invest, is when things are in a distressed state, right? That's the time to move. So I think it runs across the board, but as it relates to kind of jobs and whatnot, yeah, it's really a mixed bag. I talk to a lot of founders and a lot of folks in the entrepreneur startup community where there's a tremendous amount of uncertainty and confusion as to, like, where does this all go? We're still sitting on interest rates that's kind of a top level driver for a lot of the economic machinery that we all have to operate with. Yeah, I mean, there's still big open questions there. People are willing to make bets and put money into things, but I think in general, there tends to be a little more circumspect about it. That being said, though, I would also say there still is in the world a lot more money than sense, right? So people invest in things that, certainly from my vantage point, I have to scratch my head and ask, what compelled you to do that for that sum of money? And these are non-trivial sums of money. So yeah, it's really, it really goes across the board, and it's kind of interesting to watch from, from the inside, if you will.
Has it changed the horizons at all? And in other words, like, was there a time when you would have wanted to get a good return from a company after 5 years, and now you think maybe 10 years, or is it still the same criteria?
I mean, I think that you still look at similar horizons, because that's such a long lead. Like, let's jump on your example of a decade. Like, that's a really tough one to swallow. So if we're looking at, let's say 2 to 5 years, 2 being very aggressive, 5 probably being nominal, you're going to know within 4 or 5 years if something's going to pan out or not, for sure. I think we've lost for the most part, the examples where I see where I want to be the Uber of X. I'm going to be a unicorn. And people would say that with a straight face and be, convinced of that fact. I think that has diminished a bit. So, we had these really amazing, just hockey stick companies that popped up. I don't see that as being just an ongoing trend right now. I think there's definitely a different cadence happening.
We were really hoping to be the Uber of music/technology podcasts, so it's disappointing to hear.
There you go, right?
It's a niche market. Not much hockey stick in there.
Yeah.
Chris, I was thinking maybe you could tell us a little bit about what it's like when people pitch startups.
A lot of this is going to depend on who's the audience, right? And what type of investors what are they looking for? So in my case, we're looking for a niche where it's B2B SaaS, so software as a service. So we know all these examples that are out there to point to of what that's about. And we're looking for a company that has an MVP in place. So it exists, it's not an idea. And we're looking for something that proves product market fit. So, hey, can you show us traction? Do you have one customer that's willing to part with $1 for that, right? So from my perspective, that's the lens through which I would, at a top level, evaluate whatever pitch is being put in front of me. Now, I see tremendous amount of pitches with great ideas, or they may be in domains that I have no background or expertise that are super compelling. Like in San Diego, for example, we have a tremendous amount of biopharma, life science, and whatnot. And I peaked at biology in high school, so I have no qualifications to evaluate and in some cases even understand some of the underlying tech for it. But I can appreciate it because it's like, wow, it sounds like they're doing something really interesting and amazing. But with respect to just the particular universe in which I operate, those tend to be top line criteria, and that immediately kind of cleaves the pool of pitches between something certainly that we'd be interested in or not. That being said, there are folks where the idea, and maybe they're too early for us, where it looks like it has promise. So, we're doing this as a relationship business, right? So, we'll talk to hundreds and hundreds, 1,000 people before we find a deal that we would want to get involved in. So, so it's about really paying attention to, is there a vision there? Are there the right people to execute? If we think there's promise, we may try to help and nurture and nudge a little bit as we have time and resources to do so. But really, that's the kind of top level criteria for us when we evaluate a pitch.
What are they, when people present them? I mean, what's the shape of that? Are they coming with large presentations, a lot of people? They're representing technology, they're representing what kinds of details, what kinds of information do they present to you? And then you mentioned due diligence. You got to go out and do a lot more homework before you're even sure if you're ready.
Absolutely. Yeah. So the spectrum runs from a person who's extremely green, who shows up and tries to, have open mic night as the pitch with just seat of the pants. And for someone who's really well rehearsed and who's very sophisticated enough for it, those are actually pretty powerful. But in many cases, it's just someone who's green and learning, right? And so those typically are not so good, right? They just, they're somewhere between a train wreck and polite teaching moments, if you will, right?
And can I just dig in there? What really sets apart when people succeed in that way? I mean, what is it that you find that's working? Is it the way in which they're presenting information, the way in which they're telling a story? Do they have a narrative? Is it this type of stuff, or are there other sort of subtle things?
Well, so there's a lot of all the elements you described. So if we look at a nominal successful pitch, they're going to bring a deck of some sort, like, and it makes me cringe, a PowerPoint deck, because it's one of my least favorite things in the world, but it's an accepted universal way to organize this kind of information. Mm-hmm. So what I've found is the pitch, it's most effective when the pitch has the deck as the backing material and the founder can orate directly without having to reference it or read slides to you or go linear, slide 1, slide 2, slide 3, what have you, right?
Sure.
So those tend to be much better presentations of whatever it is they're trying to share. And so to that end, I always encourage founders to know their elevator pitch cold, be able to, we have technical problems. I can't open the deck. I can't do screen sharing. You still got to go through it, right? Those are components of it as well. And certainly like other points you brought up, which is, we want to understand a founder. So what's the story? How did you get here? What makes you an adequate or beyond expert in the thing you're chasing? And for us, a founder, a really good early indicator of there's something to look at is when a founder tends to scratch their own itch. I had this problem. I could not find a solution at all, or the solutions I found were completely unsatisfactory for reasons A, B, C, X, Y, Z. And so I decided to set out on my own to fix that problem. So that's usually a pretty nice place to start. And so that's some of the story that goes behind that. And those are very compelling because now you can have a dialogue to get into that. And on top of that, you then recognize that, and certainly from our perspective, when we look at this, we're looking for a founder that's a SME, a subject matter expert. And so that's demonstrating that because they've gone through hell to get to this point to build their company to some level where they can have an audience and talk about it. And you understand there's a depth of knowledge in that marketplace. And conversely, it's really clear when someone hasn't done any or adequate homework to understand their market, who's your customer, what's your go-to-market strategy, all of the necessary table stakes in that, those become very obvious when you kind of contrast that against the earlier scenario I described.
Yeah, I think I did. That's really interesting. I derailed a little bit where you were going. I said, so because this pitch is really just a sort of a piece of what you look at, right? There are other pieces too.
Yeah. So, I mean, the pitch typically would be like a second encounter for us. The first encounter for us would be the first level sniff test. Is there a fit for our particular flavor of what we look at? What quadrant in the universe we're playing in? And just kind of get a sense of the founder, the problem they're solving, where they're at. And a lot of that is just subjective gut feel. You've talked to enough people that you have a sense like, this person sounds like they could be difficult to work with. Great idea, but maybe we need to be careful here. And, all the variations on the theme. For us, typically like a pitch would be a second order conversation where, we would have our whole team there to listen in and weigh in from every perspective, whether it's myself focused on the tech side, or we're looking at, sales, go to market, marketing, all the way through like a customer success end of the spectrum, really evaluate it at least at that high level. So this is an hour long, 90 minutes maybe conversation. And from there, we then have to go, okay, as a team, does this sound compelling enough to take it to the next step, right?
Are there, other than large language models, are there some fashions in the pitches you're seeing these days, or is it a pretty good variety of stuff?
It is all over the map. And I think the thing, by virtue of the quadrant we play in, the folks that are trying to make the AI, ML, LLM, like pure plays, if you will, they're typically chasing a different audience than us, right? They're looking for something maybe further down the road in terms of certainly investment level. And the market is tending to bear that right now. We don't get in those conversations too deeply in terms of pure play there. Folks that we do talk to are either have incorporated elements of, I'll call it the machine learning side because LLMs are a little tricky. They've either actually deployed it in some basic form, or more often than not, it's aspirational. And then you have to differentiate, separate the wheat from the chaff of this aspiration. Do you understand what you're aspiring to, or are you just treating this as a magic black box that can do anything? And then that becomes, a difficult thing as well to evaluate, because when it's magic, it can be anything, right?
It really sounds like my AI-based coffee maker pitch that I just dreamed up a few minutes ago is really not gonna really fly very far. So Ferrari of coffee makers is my whatever bullet point for it.
Mm-hmm. If it had for us specific, for what I do specifically, that we don't play in hardware or IoT, so, or anything in that area. So we would be like, hey, we know software really well, but I don't know anything about how you get a coffee maker manufactured overseas or whatever the case may be, right? So
I don't either.
So we wouldn't have that conversation, but, and much further than that. But in terms of the general idea, what would have to come along with that is, here's my market, here's my my customer, here are the personas that I'm chasing. Here's what the market will bear. Here's what I could sell it for, et cetera, et cetera.
What's interesting, Chris, is that a number of things you've mentioned have struck a chord with me based on experiences I've had in companies I was in where the company already has a product or they already have a service, and some stakeholder, some high-level person in this company decides, oh, we're going to make a software product that is this, and it's not really our core competency, but we could take our core competency and pour it into that. And in some of these instances, in my experience, they haven't done that product market fit. They haven't done that. Do we have a market for this? And they've spent a bunch of time and money building those things and ended up in a lot of cases not really working out. It's a similar type of vetting that it sounds like should have happened. So like companies that are successful can make these same mistakes, is I guess what I'm hearing.
Absolutely. And, one of the things that, bring to the conversation is if I look at like the startup entrepreneur ecosystem, let's just say locally to us here in San Diego. So we have an amazing ecosystem of incubators, accelerators, and investors and everything in between. And if I look at, for example, let's say like SDSU's Zip Launchpad program. So you have students and similar going through basically an incubation program where they have direct, distinct homework of you have to present what is your market, what is your go-to-market strategy, who's your ideal customer candidates and personas, and without even there's no lines of code written at this point. What is the solution? How are you going to get a foothold in the marketplace, et cetera? What is the competition? And all these things, if they're not addressed early and before you start to build it, typically it doesn't work. I mean, only if you get really, really lucky does it work out. If you haven't done this homework in advance, it's really dicey, because then you're subjected to just the whims of the universe, whether it'll work out or not. And that's kind of a tough place to be, especially if you're going to put your life energy on the line and your credit cards and everything else that you're trying to do as a startup founder, right? That's a tricky thing.
Mm-hmm. You've talked about the due diligence process in evaluating startups. Is that something that happens after you've heard a pitch and decided that it was legitimate, or is it something that starts with the founder and then you come in and check it out, or how does that work?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, the due diligence process starts at word one, right? Where we're trying to just get a feel subjectively of what is the whole picture here. What's the founder about? What's the business model and product about? I may ask, in the technical side, I may ask some leading questions to get a sense of the how and what is it built. I'll definitely go snoop around, and I'll have very quickly an idea in my a picture of. I'll look at their website and find their web app and know pretty quickly where it's deployed, infrastructure, services it uses, anything that I can find public. I'll go find that out in a hot 15 minutes or so. So I go into that conversation, like the pitch, having some idea of what it is. Obviously, I can't see everything because there's a lot of stuff behind the curtain as well. But the deep due diligence doesn't happen until we've made a decision to actually, we would like to go forward and continue the conversation. And so that's where we go into that. And then the deeper due diligence happens between the pitch and between, if it's successful for both parties, between, having a term sheet, if you will, right? So you have a technical due diligence, you'll have a legal due diligence. We may look at the founders in detail because they don't know us, we don't know them. So we'll go through, we'll talk to customers, tell us about your experience. How was it? We won't leave many stones unturned going through that. Yeah, I mean, I can talk more about specifically the technical side. We'll go in, we want to understand on the legal and finance side. How much money do you have in the bank? What's your runway? Who are the investors? How have they invested? Is it all documented? Do you have a cap table? Is it accurate? All these types of things. Where are you incorporating? All the, that whole aspect of it certainly is really important, because we've seen it where a lot of the things that we want to have happen line up, but maybe there's some impossibility that occurs inside of a previous investment that has occurred, right? So someone has an investor on a safe note on some valuation that's off the charts, and it's just too rich for our blood, and we don't. And on top of that, we don't feel like that meets a reality that we could agree on, right? So there's a lot of things like that can come into play there, but we can certainly talk more about the technical side if you'd like.
When you're looking at the technical side, are you looking simply for these people know what they're talking about and they executed it well, or are you looking for, this would be hard to duplicate, or this is sort of a moat that they can rely on to deter competitors?
So I'll somewhat answer it backwards in that the moat side of it, I'm almost counting on from the business side, understanding how this would play into the marketplace. And in further expanding on that, some people play up like I have IP or I have this or I have that. And in my experience, nominally, that doesn't matter so much. So that's not the most exciting part of it. Where I start off with this, frankly, is people. I want to know the people who built this. So when we get down to it, the last thing on the list is let's go look at your GitHub or something like this, the ones and zeros. That's very last on the list. The very first thing is who built it? What are their backgrounds? Can I talk to them, look at them in the eye, so to speak, and get on the same level with them as far as understanding where everyone's coming from? And to that end, maybe I have a technical founder who's very experienced. So we get that over with in 30 seconds and we're on the same wavelength. A non-technical founder who has a green, intern plus type of person, that's maybe a harder bridge to cross because there's a larger chasm of understanding to communicate through. It gets challenging when someone overseas built it. And now we have to have a call at 2 a.m. and there's, language and communication barriers, et cetera, et cetera. So people though first, absolutely. Because without that, are they going to be reliable? Are they going to stick around if we get involved? Can they grow if it's needed? Right? So people first, absolutely. And then from there, I want to look at processes. Like, how do you do your work? Is it a complete free fire zone? Just a food fight, right?
Can you what do you mean by that?
So like quite literally, there's zero, it can be in many cases, because again, we're talking about two founders in a garage level startup in my case, there are no processes. It's just whatever, wake up in the morning with and say, hey, we're going to do this. We just do it. Right. And furthermore, there may be no technical processes on the other end. Like, what's CI/CD? How do I deploy this? Like, oh,
FTP.
Of course I copy the files over. Like, why would I do otherwise?
Right.
Now, it's totally fair, right? That an early stage company does not have all of the sophisticated trimmings, right? But at a point too, it's a little bit of a indicator or litmus test as to when people understand that some of these processes are huge accelerators and time savers too, right? So sometimes it's a tell as to where the maturity or capability of the individuals and the organization are at. The one thing that's common throughout is there's like no documentation for anything.
It sounds, Chris, a lot of this stuff sounds just like companies I've worked at in the past.
Well, right? I mean, and so often I'm the first person that prompts some of this. And one of the things I lead with when I go to start this due diligence conversation is it would be really nice to have a high level diagram of the moving parts. And most of the time it's created for the first time, if I even get it in that first conversation, by my prompting. So processes is really interesting because I'm also mindful again of, we don't expect flying cars at this stage. We just want to see, can they think through that? If we were to introduce a process, would the people, going back to the first thing, be amenable to that process? Or would they resist it? Or would they subvert it in some way, right?
It seems like there's this still this sort of pervasive idea that startup founders are going to be, 25-year-old men and women who have lots of energy and don't have a lot of, risk of, they don't have families and they don't have houses and stuff like that. How do you balance the experience and the expertise you're looking at versus people's, the risk that people are taking in terms of doing the startup themselves?
I would say that the prototype that you described there is not necessarily indicative of the real world, certainly in my experience. So yes, there are large swaths of young, energetic folks that look like, they're young white males. They look like you and me. Probably in total, they dominate the population of the startup world. But in practice, as I do kind of a mental inventory of, the folks like in our portfolio, half of them are serial entrepreneurs with families, and I got to leave this meeting. I got to pick up my sick kid from school. Everything in between. It's really a spectrum out there, but it does bring up the one commonality, which is folks who come into this space to want to be an entrepreneur, a startup founder. You have to be a little crazy. You have to be able to suspend reality. The trick is not to suspend reality forever. You have to ground yourself out. And they're willing to take risks, and they're willing to work really, really hard to get there.
I've only been working as an engineer for about 14 years, somewhere in there. And I've been a Linux hobbyist for about 20 years. So I don't have the experience you and Mike have, right? I mean, my real industry experience, it's about a decade. But when I first started, I just had so many ideas, and I'd be like, I should build this, I should build that. And, and I never really executed on any of them. Now that I'm older, I have a lot fewer ideas, and I have a lot more kind of cynicism. But I think I'd be much better as if I were going to try to be a startup founder, but I don't have an idea. I don't have a thing I really specifically want to build. So that's the thing I'm really lacking right now.
Well, the weird thing is this that I find is that most ideas already have a solution. It may not be a great solution. And you immediately narrow the universe of possibilities because that's just a fact. Mm. And so now you're struggling to either one of two things. Either you need to find some niche or uncharted territory where it truly has unique value, or you have to do something assumptively better than the other person to warrant someone paying the switching cost to go use your thing, right?
Yeah, totally.
And both are tough propositions.
Yeah, in the last couple of years, I've had a couple of ideas. I thought, I should build that, and then didn't do anything. And then 3 to 4 months later, and knowing when the idea came in my head, I can't be the only person with this idea. And then 3 to 4 months later, somebody else, open source project or company that's the same idea, and it's like, okay, I didn't do it, but there it is. There's the idea. I hope they pull it off.
Well, it's not wholly uncommon where we get a pitch and I ask a question like, oh, is that like such and such? And they're like, oh, what's that? Oh. And sometimes folks have done pretty good, due diligence in their own right, market research and whatever, and they've missed something. But oftentimes it's a reflection of they've just not
a little tunnel bothered vision.
To look. Yeah. It's like, hey, I have the great idea. Like no one else could have thought of this. And that's kind of, I hate to be that. I end up being a buzzkill when that occurs because it's like, oh.
Yeah, I guess my comment earlier was about as I've gotten older, I've gotten a lot more realistic, but I have kind of fewer ideas.
It's tough. And then also too, then you recognize that the energy, and this goes back to your thing earlier, Mike, of it takes a lot of energy, right? And then when you try to balance it out with I got to mow the lawn and I got to be up till 2 a.m. as my side hustle to build this. Decisions can be made very quickly into that context, right?
Yeah. I thought this time in my life, I'm post kids. At this point in my life, my kids are growing up. I thought I'll have more time, and I do, but I usually just want to sleep. So I think you do have to sort of be younger than I to.
But you did start a podcast. You did do something.
I started a podcast. I still, run regularly and stuff like that. But I just can't imagine putting in 70-hour weeks anymore. It just makes me yawn to think about it.
Yeah, that's a tough one, right? Once you have stories about sleeping under the desk in your cubicle, drinking Mountain Dew at 3 a.m., once you've lived that hashtag lifestyle, it's hard to imagine going back to anything near close to that, right?
I have actually never lived that life. I've had a kid the entire time I've worked in the industry, so I've never been a more than 40 hours a week kind of guy, really. I mean, I've had obviously crunch times, but in general, no.
I see less of that now, which is good. I actually see people introducing some sort of balance into some of this, which it was pure insanity for such a long time. You had kind of the the Silicon Valley bro mentality of, I'll sleep when I'm dead or something.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, well, I get what you're saying, but in practice, that's not sustainable. And you end up along the way until you fizzle out doing silly things and making bad decisions and all the rest, right? So
It's not very hardcore of you, Chris.
well, when I talk to founders, I'm also looking for that too, right? Like, hey, how, are you going to be that guy that makes your team work on Christmas Eve or Christmas Day, right? Or are you going to be a human being and do the right thing, right?
I wanted to ask, when we were talking about due diligence, did you have anything that came up in the due diligence process where you were like, wow, this is surprising based on all the times I've done this in the past? Anything that leaps to mind that you remember, or without casting aspersions on any particular?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Probably the one that stands out to me most is, and this is many, many years ago, I was at a CTO at a company where we were evaluating a kind of partnership investment relationship with a larger company out of state. And so we got on planes, flew there, go to their office, go in, meet the folks. Everyone's in a panic. This is kind of weird. You can sense the vibe in the room. And I'll contextualize this. This is 90s, right? So this is that era. Oh, our website's down. And of course, it's early e-commerce, so that's real money. The company I was part of was e-commerce as well, platforms for that. Oh, no. We don't have time to have this meeting right now. And literally whisk me into the room with developers and try to put a keyboard in front of me. Can you help me with this? Right?
They wanted you to fix their website.
Yeah, and so I don't know why and how. I mean, maybe there was some expectation that, the company I was part of, we had expertise in this area. So somehow I could magically divine the blinking cursor in front of me, not knowing anything 30 seconds earlier. So, that's probably an outstanding part of it. But, what gets me is when there's a bill of good advertised and what I see deviates very far from it. And so there's those occur occasionally. Those ones are unpleasant because it's not necessary. Either you're not ready to have the conversation or just start off the conversation where things are at. And that's one of the things I kind of politely admonish folks when I send over like the introductory, here, we're going to have a technical due diligence conversation, is keep it real. We're not trying to, you don't have to impress us at this point. We want to have a conversation. So, no one's perfect. Like you mentioned, Erik, the big companies don't get it right. So you think you're going to get it right as a 2.5 person startup? So, only in the rarest cases is that true, that they get it right or right enough. So, keep it real and make a clear distinction between that aspirational and what you really have in place. And when people blur those lines, that's when I start to really turn my antenna to full gain, because I want to understand why they're not being clear about what they're describing.
Trust there, right? That relationship is on the wrong foot.
Absolutely.
I've joked with Erik in the past that I've worked with some founders who are so convinced that they are going to be successful that they've just sort of started to pretend that they already are. Is that a generic problem with founders, that they just sort of, they want to tell you things that they think are going to happen as if they've already happened?
But wait, Mike, I thought he said suspending reality was a really good attribute to have. I was trying to figure out how.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to get at too. Is where's that fine line?
Yeah, for sure, right? So it is a real thing that there are folks that I'm not sure whether it's delusional. They read a book that's somewhere that said you have to project the reality you want to occur, or whether it's just feeling like they have to impress someone. I'm going to be the next X of Y. I'm going to be $1 billion. I'm going to be a unicorn. And they say it with such conviction, like it's truth in their heart, right? And so you see that. That's a real thing. You come across that on occasion, and that obviously has credibility problems, right? Because, that's not the case. The suspended reality thing is interesting. So kind of the example I use is something like you talk to an average startup founder, maybe they go meet with a friend they haven't spoken with in a while, and their friend doesn't know much about startups and tech and whatever. And so the friend's like, hey, so how are things going? And the founder's like, couldn't be better. The reality is, in his head, he's like, I can't make payroll. I just had my number one customer leave me. Everything's on fire, right? And so this is where, in an appropriate measure, this person's suspending reality, right? They're projecting forward. We're going to solve this problem. We're going to get on top of it. We're going to get ahead of it. Where it becomes a problem is when you need to have this serious, earnest discussion. Where are you really at? And they keep the suspended reality narrative in play, right? And that becomes challenging, certainly. You have to recognize and be able to say to the right people out loud where things really are at.
You got to be able to like take off the rose-colored glasses is what you're saying? You can put them on for a bit and take them off.
Absolutely. And I think, one of the key survival instincts in a founder's toolbox is you have to have those goggles and put them on occasion, because it's going to get rough. And, you may on certain days say, I'm going to have to throw in the towel because it's not going to work. You stick it out another day and another day and another day, you can sometimes overcome.
If you see a really great idea, but you know that it's in a space that is heavily regulated, healthcare or fintech or something like that, where there's banks involved, is that something you'd walk away from, or is that something where you try to say, okay, let's try to get you some help in building this compliance program or following these regulations?
Yeah, I think in that area, I see it split down the middle. So you may have people that are veterans of those industries who understand, quite well, or even very well, extremely well, what they're tangling with. And in those cases, that's a much easier proposition and conversation, because you can quickly get past those types of thorny issues and talk about the substance of, what's the viability of the solution you're offering and the business around that, right? The other half of it are folks that, I'm going to change the world. Healthcare is broken. Well, who doesn't? We all agree on this fact, right? And I had this crazy idea that this is how you fix it. And then you ask the question, so how long have you worked at healthcare? Like, what's your background? Oh, no, I just had this idea. Okay. Do you understand the bureaucratic complexity and regulatory environments and everything? Do you understand the 800-pound gorilla competitors in this space that you're going to have to figure out how you're going to interact with, unseat, whatever the case may be? So it really cleaves down the middle in that way. And unfortunately, there's a lot of people that have these great ideas. And I think what a symptom of this is Twitter or X or whatever it's called these days, where, and this is just going to unfortunately cast aspersions to a generalized audience, but genius ideas that come out of Silicon Valley by people with no background in the thing they're trying to solve. I'm going to solve climate change. Well, you're a software engineer. You're a business development person or whatever. Maybe you made a ton of money, good on you, because you were early days in some big startup. And so you have some funny money or funds you want to put somewhere. But nonetheless, you probably don't have the answer, right? Now, maybe you're going to go solicit and stimulate and find the right people to help you with that answer. But I think we all see where there's a lot of knee-jerk, I have an idea to solve this problem, and there's just no credible background for which to do so.
I found a lot to sympathize with in that comment there, Chris.
You don't want to hear my great idea about solving the housing crisis then, I assume.
Well, that would be exactly it. And so, but you'd want to ask the question. So you straight up. So what's your background here, right?
I've lived in a house.
And maybe you're the founder that doesn't, but maybe you have a co-founder that they've worked in this problem space for, a career. That's great. That's awesome.
So your official title is CTO. I've had a little bit of experience in that role, and it seems like an interesting role to me because it ranges all the way from, somebody fresh out of college who just started his own company to people with MBAs from Harvard, who've worked in the tech industry for 30 years. Is there sort of something that every CTO does that is common ground for all of them?
I think the common ground is that there are no 2 days alike, because you are solving multiple facets of multiple problems continuously. I think that the texture of it, the nature of the problems you're solving is going to wildly vary depending on the size and maturity of the organization. So if you're a solo founder / I'm self-appointed for life CTO, you have a different set of problems than I'm a VP of engineering at a large Fortune company, and I have divisions reporting to divisions, to teams report, like a huge hierarchy, right? But I think in both cases, you have a completely broad spectrum of needs and wants that need solutions here and now. And I think that's kind of one of the commonalities that I've seen, certainly. And it pulls on all different skill sets. So I'll straight up say that the pure technical side is probably the least used skill set in my experience going back. And what I've had to develop over the years is having, deep people skills, empathy, rally the troops, understand the product and business model, and, how do we orchestrate a roadmap to get there? And how do I get business people who don't know what it takes to build it to understand what the reality of what they're asking for is? And shielding engineers from craziness that comes from a lot of those different directions. So, and HR issues, and, I'm having a vacation, or, everything in between, or I had an offer from another company. Are you going to counter that? Or am I going to walk out so it really runs the gamut of things on a daily basis. And then at the end of the day, it's like, hey, I'd like to get my hands on a keyboard. That'd be cool. And, once you cross a certain threshold, that's not the case. You're kind of stuck at, if you're doing technical things, you're either doing things at kind of a higher level, like I'm talking about, architectural solutions, or perhaps relying on some past expertise to troubleshoot some spot problem. Maybe I'm starting to introduce processes in place that I know from past experience make sense. We weren't ready for them yesterday, but we're going to be ready for them today or tomorrow. But yeah, that's one of the things about the job, is that there are no 2 days the same, it would appear to me.
I was really interested in that same question. There's I imagine if they have a Venn diagram of the skills and responsibilities of a CTO, that the shared parts of the Venn diagram get pretty thin as you go from a small company to a medium-sized company to a large company. When I worked in a large company, I would go to these presentations by the CTO, and there'd be 10,000 people in the engineering org in the audience, and the person on stage seemed really far removed from the day-to-day work that I would have imagined when I worked at a smaller company. The CTO sat, a few rows over, and that guy wrote Python, and deployed stuff to AWS. It's such a different job. It's almost like being one in a small company wouldn't prepare you for a medium or large size. It seems completely dissimilar to me.
Yeah, and I think to that end, I know some companies have tried to do better with this over the years, but there's not a system that I've seen applied consistently that nurtures folks that have the technical inclination to go to a CTO type role and then grow beyond kind of a smaller organization to a larger one. And there's a built-in assumption that you're just going to stay stuck in this track, but not give you the skills to work with the new realities you'll face as you go up the food chain, right? Mm-hmm. So, you have folks in big companies that are, distinguished scientists or whatever the title may be. And yes, they get to do their focus on their little slice of the world. But other than that, if you're like a VP of engineering or something at a larger company, wow, you're trying to just keep on top of intertribal warfare within your company, right? So, and the engineering is almost an afterthought at some level, right?
Are you a believer in the two pizza team sort of approach to things, or do you think engineering organizations can scale to bigger teams?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I guess I'm somewhat resistant to slogan-driven organizational processes. I think that it rings true that once you get to a certain size, it's just untenable to have that literally that many people in a room. To kind of change it up a little bit, one of the challenges that I see is not so much the size, but the character of those get-togethers. The truism of like, this could have been solved in an email. Why are we having a meeting? We have tools to communicate this. Why do we need to go have everyone sit down and waste valuable time? When I look at, certainly with the lenses of a startup, time is the enemy. You cannot move fast enough. So every minute you spend doing things that are unnecessary, you're behind the curve. You know, whether it's a 2-pizza meeting or I need to send an email or I can get on a quick Slack huddle or a Zoom call, whatever the case may be, do the most efficient thing for that setting. I find I do a lot of work with a lot of teams remotely, and we keep it small, we keep it quick, we keep it to the point. If we need to go have bigger discussions, we break out. We rarely need to have like everyone tied up for large periods of time because that's just really inefficient. And no one walks away from that feeling satisfied, in my experience.
There's so much commentary sort of underneath what you're saying that's about trends in our industry, things that we see in our industry. For example, you're talking about, a CTO going from one organization to another, a large organization, there's not really a path for them. Similarly, there's not really paths for a long time for engineers who want to stay engineers and kind of continue to advance up some sort of career ladder. It sort of exists now. That's a little more common now, but it used to be you were an engineer and then you became a manager. Hope you're good at it, that kind of thing. Like, we never really solved a lot of these problems. And now you're talking about waste. And it sounds like, if you're a startup and you've got a lot of wasteful practices, you're not going to survive. So you have to cut that. But then we do notice as our organizations get larger, there's just sort of this entropy almost. I know Mike loves the entropy metaphor. He doesn't like the entropy metaphors, but it's like the waste starts happening and you don't want it there. I want to just be as efficient as possible. So there's really interesting critiques in what you're saying about our work, about our field.
Absolutely, right. And going back to like the CTO track. So someone who can handle the CTO job at a small level, small as in like small team, and it's very technically focused, may not have the people skills, or they're not nurtured to take them to a spot where they can go manage a larger organization, right? And frankly, some people aren't cut out for it, right? So folks that, they can be a CEO of a small company, but there's no way they could be a CEO of a public company. Just don't have the capabilities, skill set, experiences, whatever the case. They would just objectively fail at that, right? And, it holds for all profession, all lines of profession. And particularly since in the tech world, we get kind of put into this generalization of like, all the geeks, they're high functioning Aspies or something, and they don't work with people well. There's that kind of that aspersion that gets cast often. And it's like, no. I mean, there are truisms to some of these things, but the reality is some folks just need mentoring and nurturing and a path to get there. And kind of on your comment of time wasting. So as an example, go into an organization and, yes, we do Scrum. We have a daily stand-up. Okay, it's been going on for a half hour. What are we doing?
Yeah.
And all of a sudden get someone with some experience and get their hands on the wheel. We're done in 3 minutes, right? So we've just given this organization back, however many people hours of productivity just by being aware and having some control and some experience around that.
I think I've been in that Scrum meeting.
We've all been in it, right? And so, one of the things that I end up doing often is a lot of mentoring. And so I may go shadow some of these things and then give folks feedback like, hey, you're not being effective with the team. No one wants to be there. If we want to conduct business and move on, and if you have to have a conversation with someone, have your own conversation. You don't need to drag everyone in on that, right? And that's a tough one because particularly when founders are driving at that early of a level, it's really hard for them to let go, and they want to have control. They want to understand what's happening, who's doing what. And the founders that succeed have the ability to let go at some level. They're able to say, okay, I have to have trust and confidence in the people and the processes and everything around that that we're nominally going to get to the endpoint in the direction that we've set out to do. And that kind of circles back to, we talked about due diligence earlier, would be the next thing again, we're not talking about ones and zeros. What's your roadmap? And, the answer many times is in my head. That's cool, but like, how are we going to execute what's in your head? And so this is one of the other, challenges as well. And so when folks can actually have some sort of sufficiently adequately documented roadmap, then everyone can get in the same direction. Founders can let go a bit, because often founders, unless it's a true technical founder, often founders are far better suited to other aspects of the organization. They're going to be the SME who knows, the subject matter expert who knows this world inside and out, who can drive or shadow the sales demo to help close the deal, or produce the marketing strategy or seed that to, effectively reach customers, or whatever the case may be. And the last thing is that you want them to do is like be up close to the ones and zeros side in that situation.
There's a software metaphor in there, right? Like if you can really cleanly decompose problems, then you end up with a thing that's easier to reason about and usually easier to work on and scale and maintain or whatever.
Oh, 100%. Absolutely. Yeah.
I think this has been great info. Is there anything you want to wrap up with, Chris?
I guess what I'd leave folks with is, if there's a interest in doing a startup entrepreneurship, or you're in it early days, I would highly recommend to go find in your local community the ecosystem that supports that. We're lucky enough here in San Diego, for example, to have a pretty vibrant ecosystem. We have, like I mentioned earlier, we have incubators, accelerators, all types of things that people can lean on for resources. I would highly advise folks to go take advantage of those resources. Many of those resources will be more than happy to help you. Many of them may be through like educational or government grant type of things, where there's no equity dilution as part of it. They're just genuinely there to help you. So I would highly recommend folks to take advantage of that. Now, if it's not your first rodeo and you've done this before, then that's fine. But even then, like, just getting refreshed. Like, for example, I really look at this process, going through selling your idea. It's a perishable skill, much like interviewing, right? So you want to practice as much as you can in an environment that doesn't have deep repercussions, so that when you get in front of the right person, you nail it, or close to as possible. So those are great settings for it. So I just can't encourage highly enough folks that want to go on this crazy adventure to go seek out those resources, because they will pay deep dividends as you go forward.
Mike, what was your what was it? Housing pitch? Did you have an actual housing pitch?
Yeah, it involves getting senior citizens to voluntarily move into tents.
Is that better or worse than my artificial intelligence-driven coffee machine?
So, I mean, my retirement...
Have we not already done that in San Diego?
That's a good point. My retirement plan is basically to live in a tent. So.
Well, thanks so much for talking to us today, Chris. It was great having you on. Really appreciate it. Nice to meet you.
Likewise. Yeah, it was great to be here. It was great to share a bit, and enjoying your backlog of podcasts, and continue listening forward.
Cool. That sounds great. Thanks so much. This has been Picture Me Coding. My name is Erik Aker. My co-host, Mike Mull. Thanks again, Mike.
Thank you.
We'll see you later. Bye-bye.
See you next time.